A soft, refined chime echoed gently through the first-class lounge. Piano notes floated quietly from speakers hidden behind marble walls. The whispers of personal assistants, the brushing sound of silk sleeves grazing touchscreens, and in the farthest corner, Selene Hart sat alone. Not quite sat, but more like a piece of luggage that had been placed down. Elegant, silent, and invisible. Her finger trembled slightly as she tried to lift the white porcelain coffee cup off its saucer. It clinked. No one looked up. No one approached. The entire room continued spinning around her as if she had never existed. Selene hated that feeling, undeniably present, yet forgotten like air. Just a few meters away near the self-service station, typically reserved for staff or economy passengers, delayed by missed connections, a man knelt down tying the shoelaces of a pink backpack for his daughter. Sleeves rolled up calloused hands, weary shoulders. He didn't belong here. His name was Mason Cole. Their flight had been canceled. He and his young daughter Ivy were hoping for standby seats on the next one. Ivy looked up and whispered, "Daddy, why is that lady sitting all alone?" Mason followed her gaze. The woman didn't look fragile. She looked like someone well acquainted with not being asked anything at all. And then he stood up. Not to help, just simply to see a person. Mason walked slowly across the marble floor, not with the urgency of a rescuer, but as if heading toward something that simply needed to be seen. Selene Hart looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, but the first thing she noticed were his shoes worn scuffed at the toes, so real they made her pause. She was used to being approached out of curiosity, pity, or motives harder to name. But this man didn't touch her wheelchair, didn't crouch down in fake courtesy. He just sat, leaving the perfect amount of space. "Would you mind if I wait here?" For the flight, he asked. No polite smile, no tone of pity, just a presence simple and clear. Selene hesitated, then gave the slightest nod, like nodding to herself after years of uncertainty. Mason pulled a chair closer gently without a single wasted word. They sat there, saying nothing, and needing nothing to be said. For the first time in hours, Selene didn't feel like a display figure in a luxury set. She was real, breathing, trembling with someone beside her, not out of duty but empathy. A short distance away, Ivy continued to watch them, her tiny fingers digging for a crayon in her jacket pocket. And in that moment, the real story began. Not with words, but with a silence worth keeping. Near the vending machines, little Ivy sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, her teal jacket slipping off one shoulder. She pulled out an old boarding pass, its back still blank, and chose a purple crayon, the one she always kept in her pocket for really special moments, as she'd once told her dad. And Ivy began to draw. Not loudly, not for show. Just a pair of young eyes recording what grown-ups so often miss, two people sitting side by side saying nothing, yet the world between them had somehow changed. Far away, Selene still held her coffee cup with both hands to stay warm, to control the faint tremors, or maybe just to hold on to something familiar on such a foreign-feeling day. She didn't speak. Mason didn't either. But the silence wasn't heavy. It offered space, a quiet permission to just be without needing explanation. Mason tilted his head toward her. "Private flight." Selene nodded lightly. "Hydraulic failure. They haven't said when it'll be fixed." Her voice was soft but clear, not hesitant, seasoned, and a bit weary. "You commercial. Got canceled. Now just waiting." Selene glanced at Ivy, now hunched over her drawing. Your daughter Mason smiled. "Yeah." Her name's Ivy, 10 years old, addicted to drawing and thinks vending machine breadsticks are a gourmet meal. For the first time in hours, the corner of Selene's mouth moved not quite a full smile, but enough for something inside her to crack just slightly. "Selene," she said softly. "Mason." He held out his hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her hand was cold and delicate. His was rough, steady, but in that brief touch there was no pity, no divide, only a feeling. For the first time today, someone really saw me. Ivy stood up, holding the boarding pass now covered in crayon. She hesitated a few seconds as if asking herself whether to give it. Then, without a word from her dad, she tiptoed toward Selene and Mason, gripping the drawing tightly as if afraid it would be swept away by the drafty corridor. Selene saw her first. Her gaze landed gently on the child's face, familiar like a memory, yet unfamiliar in its presence. She nudged Mason with her elbow. "She's coming," she whispered, as if not to break the fragile moment. Ivy stopped in front of Selene, her hand slightly shaking as she extended the drawing. "I made this for you," she said, voice barely above a breath. Selene looked down. In the crayon drawing was a woman in a wheelchair, a man beside her, and in between them a little girl. The lines were clumsy, but unmistakable. They were connected by presence, not by separation. Selene raised her hand to cover her mouth. Her eyes widened not in shock, but because something had been touched. She received the drawing with both hands, cradling it like something fragile. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ivy beamed. "You looked kind of lonely. Now you don't." Selene looked up at Mason. Her eyes began to glisten, and for the first time in so long, something inside Selene, cold, closed-off, gilded, began to crack. "I can't remember the last time someone did something just because I existed," she said, voice soft as breath. Ivy climbed into her father's lap. Selene kept looking at the drawing, then carefully folded it and placed it into her purse like a treasure. Somewhere deep inside, a door quietly creaked open. None of the three noticed that the soundscape of the lounge had begun to shift. Rushed footsteps overlapping boarding calls, luggage rolling across the stone floor, all faded into the background of one thing more distinct: the stillness between them. Selene still held the drawing in her palm, as if it were proof that she had been seen. Not by a system or her father's rigid itinerary, but by a child. And a stranger. She tilted her head, looking at Ivy dozing on Mason's shoulder, still clutching her crayon. "She believes in things adults have forgotten how to feel," Selene said softly. Mason nodded, needing no elaboration. "She always sees things before I do." Selene turned her eyes toward the window. Outside, the rain had started to fall, the kind that quiets the world. "I used to think people avoided me because of this wheelchair," she whispered. "But more and more, I believe. Maybe they stay away because they assume someone else already cares." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "But they're wrong." Mason didn't rush to reassure. He just sat listening, as if every pause in her words mattered. "No one asks if I'm okay," she continued. "They just need me to show up on time, smile the right way, sign where I should, and disappear on cue." Then, for the first time in their conversation, Selene turned fully to face him. "You're the first person today who looked me in the eyes." It wasn't said with drama, but it landed like a single drop breaking a still lake. And Mason understood it wasn't blame. It was thanks. Through the glass, Selene's private jet still sat on the runway, veiled by rain as thin as mist. The propellers were still, the stairs lowered, the lights blinking, waiting not for a schedule but for a heart signal. She glanced at her watch, then down at her hands. Her fingers had stopped trembling, but still clutched the now cold coffee cup. "Do you think, if the plane's ready, I should go?" Her voice was soft, almost a question to herself. But Mason understood. She wasn't asking about schedules. She was asking if this moment should end. "You get on that plane," he answered gently, "and the world keeps turning. And I go back to the loneliness I know," she added, not bitter, just true. Mason didn't correct a single word. He let that truth rest between them like an untouched linen laid out for two. "I used to think people didn't know what to say to me, that the wheelchair made them awkward," Selene continued. "But now I think they just assumed someone else was already taking care of me." She looked up, but no one really asked. Silence, the kind heavy with truths never spoken. "You don't need to know everything about my life," Selene said, "but I want to tell you." And for the first time she began to say it all. About her father. About the image she was forced to maintain. About expectations tied to reputation, not to her humanity. "I stopped expecting kindness," she said, as if closing an old chapter. Mason tilted his head. Until today, Selene gave a quiet nod. And for the first time in so long, something rose in her chest. Not tears, but hope. Small, but real. Footsteps echoed from the end of the corridor. A sharply dressed airport staffer in a gray uniform approached, clipboard in hand, eyes glancing smoothly across the faces in the room. He stopped in front of Selene and gave a respectful nod. "Miss Hart," he announced clearly, "your private jet is ready for departure." She had heard those words countless times before shareholder meetings, before fundraising galas, before arrivals made for reputation, not for her presence. But this time, it sounded different. Selene took a deep breath, her eyes briefly brushing across his name tag, then turned to Mason. "I suppose." "It's time," she said softly, without urgency. Mason nodded, standing up. No prompting, no stepping back. He simply waited. She placed her hand on the wheel. Her fingers paused for just a moment. Then unexpectedly, Selene turned and asked, her voice barely above a whisper, like a rare invitation. "Would you walk me to the gate?" Mason didn't hesitate. "Of course." And so, they walked. Not as strangers, not as VIP and passerby, but as two people who had shared something silent yet profound, something that might be called compassion, or perhaps the quiet bloom of real connection. The corridor leading to the private gate was still. Every turn of the wheelchair wheels on the stone floor echoed like the heartbeat of newfound determination. Ivy held her father's hand in one, the other clutched her crayon box, believing perhaps that another drawing was waiting to be made. Outside the glass door, the aircraft sparkled beneath the gentle rain, but Selene didn't hurry. She paused at the threshold, eyes looking into the space ahead. "I don't want to say goodbye yet," she whispered. Mason looked at her. In his gaze was something she thought no one would ever offer her again. A look that asked for nothing, except the truth. In front of them, the jet stairway had been lowered. The door opened, the cabin lights casting a soft glow, elegant, cold, and familiar. Everything was ready. The crew stood by. No one rushed her, but everything implied it's time to go. Selene didn't move. Mason stood beside her. No questions, no pressure. Ivy stayed silent, just tightening her grip on her father's hand. Selene lowered her gaze to her wheels, then looked up, her voice as faint as mist. "I don't want to go, but I don't know how to stay." Mason turned crouching slightly so his eyes met hers, just as he had in the lounge the first time. "You don't have to know everything," he said slowly. "Just know what feels right." She looked at him longer than she'd looked at anyone in recent years, not to judge, but to search for something truly safe, not in power, not in money, not in a schedule. "I've spent my whole life trying to please my father," she said more clearly this time. "Every decision, every trip, every meeting was never about me." Then she let out a small laugh, nodding toward the waiting jet. "How ironic. The world thinks I'm free, and only I know I managed to the minute." Ivy looked up, her voice light as paper. "If you don't go, will you stay here then?" Selene turned to the little girl. Didn't answer right away, just looked at that face, simple, sincere, asking for nothing but a true word. Then she said very softly, "Maybe for the first time I want to decide for myself." And when Mason gently extended his hand, not to push, just to walk with her, Selene placed hers in it, not to ask for help, but to say, "I'm ready to move forward, not with my legs, but with my heart." She didn't say another word. She simply turned her wheels imperfectly, a bit unsteady, but clearly on her own. Not pushed by a nurse, not guided by an assistant, not summoned by an imposed agenda. Mason walked beside her, his hand resting behind the chair, not pushing, just present. Ivy walked a few steps ahead, her tiny backpack swaying, humming a nameless tune. They turned their backs on the waiting jet, took a quiet hallway left behind the gleaming marble, and entered an area few ever visited, where fluorescent lights flickered faintly and the floor tiles had faded. The scent of cheap coffee and the hum of a vending machine were the only things there. But Selene didn't complain. She rolled slowly, each turn of the wheels a quiet declaration. "This movement is mine. No one else's." Mason paused by an old coffee machine and pressed for an espresso. It hissed softly, dripping dark liquid into 2 crumpled paper cups. He handed one to Selene, not overly polite, not careless. Just right. She accepted it with both hands, took a sip, winced. "That's awful," Mason smiled. "But at least you chose it." She nodded and laughed. For the first time in many days, maybe months, that laugh didn't come from effort or social ritual. It came from something more real: freedom. Selene leaned back slightly in her chair, fingers rotating the warm paper cup. "You know something," she said, voice steady. "I haven't crossed a room by myself in weeks. People just help, push, plan, without ever asking if I even want that." Mason didn't answer, just tilted his head, gaze steady. "Well, now I'm doing it myself." Selene smiled again. This time no one showed her the way, and that was real motion. A faint buzz cut through the steady sound of rain outside the window. Selene glanced at the phone on the plastic table. The screen lit up Dad. Priority line. No surprise. No message asking how she was. Never had been. Only instructions cloaked in silence and duty. Her finger hovered over the screen. She didn't answer, didn't hang up, just hesitated. Mason looked over. "Didn't interfere." "You know what I'm afraid of," Selene said, eyes still on the screen. "I'm not scared he'll yell. I'm scared he won't say anything, that he'll just assume I boarded, that I'm still obedient on time perfect." She swallowed. A dry smile brushed her lips like a scab just healing. And if I don't go, she asked, revealing a vulnerability she'd never shown before. No one will come looking. No one will ask. Mason tilted his head calm but firm. No plans. No one waiting. Doesn't mean you're lost. It only means... He paused, letting the silence say the rest. You're starting over. Selene pressed her lips together, then took a deep breath. Her finger tapped the screen mute. No answer. The phone stayed on the table, but it was silent. Just like the authority that once weighed her down now had no power. She turned to Mason, voice soft but certain. I want to see where this cup of coffee takes me. Mason lifted his cup, gently tapped hers. Then don't miss it. Selene nodded. Not because someone waited, but because for the first time she chose herself as the destination. Selene exhaled slowly, as if years of exhaustion had just been granted permission to leave her chest. Then from the leather bag beneath her seat, she pulled out something familiar. A real leather binder, square-edged dark brown, smelling of power and plans that had never asked for her input. Mason saw it didn't ask, but his eyes seemed to understand this wasn't just paperwork. It was a living map of her life drawn by someone else's hand. Selene opened it gently. Inside line after line of perfectly formatted schedules, investor meeting in Geneva, keynote speech in Boston, cover photo shoot for next month's business magazine, strategic partner meeting in Seoul. She flipped faster. Every page full. Timetables, locations, spreadsheets. Not a single blank. Not a single note asking whether she ever wanted any of it. Selene took out a black pen from her purse. Then with one steady breath, she drew a long line down the entire first page. One line. No hesitation, no curve. Mason didn't react with surprise, just a small nod. Respectful. Selene closed the binder and set it aside. I'm not going back, she said, calm, resolute. He looked at her. No advice, no doubt. Just one thing in his eyes, the freedom to choose. I don't know what's ahead, she continued. But I know I don't want to keep walking with people who only see the version of me they need. Mason smiled. Then, you're in the right place. Ivy stirred, rubbing her eyes. Did she miss her flight? Daddy. Selene leaned over, gently brushing the girl's messy hair. No, sweetheart. I didn't miss anything. I just changed destinations. Outside the towering window, the private jet began to taxi, navigation lights blinking, the propellers spinning gently. It took off as it had many times before, but this time Selene Hart was not on board. She sat quietly by the vending machines, cradling a paper cup of bitter coffee, her face peaceful as if sipping the world's most expensive espresso. Not because of the taste, but because for the first time she had chosen to stay. Ivy curled up beside Mason, head resting on his jacket arms still wrapped around her crayon box. Beside her lay a new drawing, this time not someone in a wheelchair, but a woman standing upright in the rain, holding the hand of a man and a little girl between them, holding a crayon like a flag. Selene looked at the drawing, her hand gliding softly over the still warm wax lines. She didn't cry. But in her eyes was something deeper than tears. She had remembered what it felt like to be real. The phone on the table no longer buzzed. No texts. No missed calls. Perhaps her father had given up. Or worse, perhaps he never noticed she hadn't boarded. She took a deep breath and looked up at Mason. I don't know where I'm going. No plan. No one waiting. He met her gaze, voice calm, That's not being lost, Selene. That's beginning. She nodded. Not in acceptance, but in ownership. Ownership of time, of choices, of a voice long muted by perfection. Selene opened her bag, pulled out the crossed-out binder, then slowly placed Ivy's drawing on top. Like a new map, not of flight routes, but of real movement from within. Mason reached out lightly, touching her hand. She didn't pull away. For the first time in a very long time, Selene didn't feel she had to be anywhere else, because where she sat with people who expected nothing from her was the perfect place to begin.